Hey there. Uh, First thing I want to do on behalf of Oregon Humanities is say a big welcome to Eric Ward. Eric, it's great to see you here.
It's great to see you. Adam, it's
Um,
been a while since we've been together, but it's wonderful to see you.
yeah, and we're doing this on screen, but I'm glad we're doing this. And maybe I'll
Yeah.
say a word about what we're doing, and then we'll jump into conversation. Again, my name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities, and we've been running a series called Consider This for the last 6 months or so that's been focused on democracy, participation, activism, and to some extent, change. What kind of changes we can hope to make, barriers to participation, that sort of stuff. Beginning with Jamel Bowie up through Masha Gessen, David French, Emma Green, Leah Satile, and Eric, after you, we'll have Clint Smith and Astra Taylor, and we're thinking about democracy in lots of ways. And the form is we're going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll invite viewers to log in through a Zoom and talk to each other about the ideas you're helping us think about. Before we jump in, I want to say a very quick thanks to just a few organizations, and then we're just going to jump in and start talking. So the
Excellent.
thanks are,
Excellent.
yeah, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, Northwest Natural, Tonkin Torp, Stoll Reeves, the Kinsman Foundation, and the City of Portland's We Are Better Together program. This specific program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and this event is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Portland. So a big thanks to all of those organizations for the many ways they've supported this and other stuff around the state and the country for some of them. Eric, we've been trying to take the long view around democracy, even while the news has, I think, pummeled many people, not just the news in newspapers and on TV and radio, but also the way people are feeling things in their daily lives. We're still trying to step back a little bit and think about democracy over the long term, both what it looks like when it's healthy and what the biggest barriers are. And you use a phrase in some of your writing and talking. The phrase is inclusive democracy. And while I think we've been talking about inclusive democracy, I hadn't really encountered that phrase, exactly that term. And I wanted to ask you about it a little bit to start. Like, what does the adjective do when you add inclusive onto democracy?
Yeah. So, it's wonderful to be here and to have this conversation. And the conversation around democracy is so critical, even for those of us who are racial justice activists. Look, to be clear, strong democracy doesn't ensure racial or gender equity in a society. But by the same token, I can tell you that gender and racial equity will never be secured and sustained without democratic practice. And that is why democracy becomes such a critical question in this moment. We'll have a chance to dive into a little bit more. But I use the term in inclusive democracy to reinforce, I think, some specific core ideas surrounding democratic practice. The first is one that I'm often reminded about by Glenn Harris, the executive director of Race Forward, who constantly reminds us that democracy, or the word demos, means the people. And it's actually a really radical idea. It is the idea that people do not need kings or royalty or dictators, right, to help them manage a society together, a collective societal agreement with one another. That government is here, right, to serve a population, not vice versa. And it is a radical idea and it is hard to hold together. When I say inclusive democracy, what I mean is people driven government that is accountable and transparent and that is abundant in its idea of people, We should realize in this moment, Adam, we are being confronted by an authoritarian culture. It is manifested within the alt-right and white nationalist movement, but it actually is impacting all of us. It is happening because we are in a world that is facing immense change. Change creates anxiety. Anxiety from change is actually quite natural, but we feel it nonetheless. And in those moments of change and anxiety, we seek stability. And there are some in our society, here and outside the US, who have sought to take advantage of that anxiety. Democracy, though, is the idea that we as people, as a society, can solve those problems and that we can approach and manage that anxiety by turning towards one another, leaning in. So, when I mean inclusive democracy, as I said, we're talking about transparent, accountable government, but it also means a very generous, broad definition of who we mean when we say people. And sadly, in the United States, often who we define as people, right, democracy, has been limited by class, race, religion, right, elitism. And my belief is the way that we prosper as a society, the way that we are healthy, is we expand who we consider part of democracy in America. That's inclusive democracy. It is about moving forward together, not separating ourselves, right? But building a community where we all find meaning and belonging in our families, in our community, and in one another.
So there's a ton there. There's a ton to think about from the what it is you're describing, and of course how to get there. I want I kind of want to slow us down a little bit and
Yeah.
stick with the phrase for just a second, and to ask, is, is inclusive, when you write about or talk about inclusive democracy and use that phrase, uh, I guess I want to ask, is there democracy that's not inclusive? In other words, is
Yeah.
inclusive doing work of emphasis, or is it a particular kind of democracy?
Yeah. So there are exclusive forms of democracy. The United States, which is a democracy that is managed through a Republican form of government, right? We elect legislators to represent us, um, was primarily an exclusive form of democracy until the mid 1960s with the arrival of significant civil rights victories that were won in the South, largely by Black activists and their allies. John Lewis once said that democracy in the United States was an aspiration until the civil rights movement of the 1960s made it a reality. I am not going to debate John Lewis, who's no longer with us. What I often say, though, is what John Lewis meant was that there was a limited form of democracy in America. And it was democracy where the people were considered to be white Christian males who owned property, and everyone else need not apply. At first, those white Christian males who owned property were only a small inkling. They were considered Anglo Saxon, right? Italians, Swedish, right? Irish were not considered part of that demos. It is through the struggle of the African American civil rights movement and others, that demos, the people, is expanded in terms of definition. We have become a more inclusive democracy in 2020 than we were in 1920, and certainly much more significant than we were in 1820 or 1720. Still, we have a ways to go. There are still too many people who are not involved in the day to day civic life that is necessary for a vibrant democracy, a place where everyone can live, love, worship, and work free from fear. It is time for us, right, to move into an inclusive democracy. We need it. We need a strong society where people can feel that they are at home, where there is opportunity, prosperity, right, and the ability to build the creative imagination that is needed to tackle real issues in our society, not just the global pandemic, right, but a changing and shifting economy, climate, right? Education, jobs, safety. This cannot be done through an exclusive form of democracy. We have to have inclusive democracy to be able to compete against the rise of authoritarianism and political violence, not only here in Oregon, but around the country and world.
It's interesting. It's interesting how you are connecting it earlier to change and anxiety. That is a move towards
Yes.
authoritarianism as I think the big counter to inclusive democracy, and tying that move to change and therefore anxiety. Um, in some of the stuff you've been writing most recently, you've suggested that we're further along in the aspirational project you just mentioned than I think some people would say. You've even said we're still in the battle, but we're further along in the war for inclusive democracy than it looked like. And you've also used the word precipice a few times. And I
Yes.
want to ask about that. So I said at the beginning we were going to take the long view, but I do want to ask you something about the current moment, and that is, like, where are we with respect, in your view, to a precipice moment, or is it a kind of long arc like the one you began to lay out from 1820 forward?
Yeah. We are certainly in long arcs, and I want to talk about this arc, but I think there's something important to always understand and for us to hold, which is
Yeah.
arcs can always be disrupted, right?
Uh-huh.
Arcs can be cut short. And what we know, I have lots of friends who play sports.
Uh-huh.
Thankfully, I'm not one of them. I get to admire that
Okay.
athleticism. Um, but one of the things that I know from talking to my friends who do play sports, some professionally, is you are most likely to lose a game once you're winning, right?
Mm.
The hard part isn't winning a game. The hard part is holding on to the win,
Hmm.
right? And you have to give more attention towards the end of something than you do at the beginning. And I think if we think about generational arcs in 7 generations, right? 70 years, 10 years each, that tends to be how social movements ebb and flow in our society. The civil rights movement in this country is 7 generations old, and so is the backlash to it. But we should be clear that the struggle for democracy is ever unfolding, right? There is no like clear finish line. Oh, we've reached democracy. Oh, we've reached equity. In each generation, we have to try to expand a society, right, in ways that allow the involvement of more people. The more alienated any individuals are in a society, right, the more isolated they are, the more likely it is they can be marginalized, or the likelihood that they could fall into nihilism, right, and hope from that anxiety. So when I talk about this, what I mean is that we have to understand we are on an arc, and I believe it's an arc that we've won. I don't think we are dealing with the end. I used to say we were in the moment of the end of one age and the beginning of the other. And what I mean by that is too many of us think we are in some dystopian moment, right? That things are coming to an end. That's absolutely not true. And you know why it's not true, Adam, is because those things already ended. We've just realized that those things have come to an end.
Mm.
Inequality, white supremacy, right? The fear of one another, the false equation of race in our society, right? The idea that there can't be enough paying jobs for everyone, right? And hope for families. Those are notions that hardly anyone in American society believes anymore. We may accept it, we may have to live under it, but all of us know better. And the reason we know better is that we're at the beginning of a new period, and it is a
Mm,
new time for America, right? It is the fourth American Revolution. And it is not a revolution that is a physical revolution, it's a revolution of the imagination. And
mm,
much of what we see from the political violence in Oregon, in the country, is much more of a backlash, a grieving of the loss of a former age. And sadly, because of this demographic anxiety, individuals have tapped into that grief, right, and have utilized it to focus harm on marginalized communities and on the practice of democracy itself. It's why many, sadly, studies show us today that Republican voters are more likely, right, to reject democratic practice if it means that they cannot maintain power in society, right?
mhm,
That is a rejection of democracy. But it's not just a rejection of democracy, it's a rejection of the abundance of America, the ability to hold its diversity, and the ability to hold a broad imagination. It is an idea that America can't actually be the vibrant, aspiring country that we all want it to be. And we have watched this play out in very significant ways in Oregon. Political violence that has led to murders, right? We know physical beatings, hate crimes. And the rest of the country has come over the last few years to experience the same pieces. The deal is this, though: when I say we've already won, what I mean is we should understand, right, that the white nationalist movement in this country, right, isn't wasn't created out of oxygen. It was really a reaction
mm.
to America moving closer to an inclusive democracy. It's an attempt to disrupt the momentum towards an inclusive democracy. It's an attempt to continue to try to feed into old stereotypes that led to racial violence and discrimination against marginalized communities. But if we figure out how to manage this, if we continue to bring more people together, ultimately, the white nationalist movement will have very little impact on democracy in America.
So, which is a wonderful thing to imagine from this moment where I think we do feel the impact in so many ways. And you used the phrase revolution of the imagination, which
And
is
Adam,
a
if you hear
beautiful,
me, you might be on mute.
yeah,
There we go.
yeah, I'm back. Okay, I apologize. You used the phrase revolution of the imagination, which is a beautiful phrase. And I also want to ask, I want to try to anchor some of your work as concretely as possible. And I want to ask,
Yeah.
like, how do you work on a revolution of the imagination? Like on a day-to-day basis, what does it mean to do that kind of work?
Yeah. It's we are a society that has come to treat imagination as in a hostile fashion. But
Mm,
America largely has been built on imagination, unimaginable horrors, right? And imaginative moments of community and solidarity. When I talk about imagination, what we mean is helping people find their way back to their home, right? To the United States, understanding, right, that they have a place in this society, that they have a place in this destiny. And we think the most effective way of achieving those is first challenging what we call demographic anxiety. And let me
mm,
explain what that is. That may be a new term. So demographic anxiety is a natural occurring, right, tension that results when the demographics of a population shift, right? We are in the United States. We are a country that is uh, uh, um, experiencing great demographic shifts in our country, and that creates anxiety. One of the problems, though, is that that anxiety gets framed in only two ways. By those of us in the human rights movement, we often frame that anxiety as racism, right? And that is because of the way that implicit and explicit racism act out in society. But the fact of the matter is that that kind of demographic anxiety is quite natural. The other way it gets framed is by white nationalists and other anti-democratic movements, and small d, right? Anti-democratic. And the way that they frame that demographic anxiety is they say it's not natural either, but they frame it as an existential threat, right? That you are feeling that anxiety because you are facing some type of threat. It has been framed by the white nationalist movement as white genocide falsely, but it is also not that. In truth, all of us experience demographic anxiety, right? Not just white society. All of us experiences as individuals. If you have ever walked into a space full of people in your lifetime who you didn't know and weren't familiar with, that feeling you were experiencing is
Uh-huh.
demographic anxiety, right? And what we know about demographic anxiety is that you don't overcome it by fleeing it. You overcome it by exposing yourself to your neighbors, to your community over and over. Kids who are nervous about going to school, we don't respond by saying, well, then you don't have to go to school. What we understand is the more that they attend school, the more that they are in a supportive environment that understands that change breeds anxiety, the more likely that student is to acclimate themselves into that community and become, right, a leader of that community. That's what we mean by addressing demographic anxiety. And the way that we do that specifically, I believe, is through addressing first the desegregation, right? We have too much segregation in Oregon still, whether we are talking about segregation in transportation, housing, education, or employment. That is not just an economic cost to communities of color. As I've said before, it is also a cost to democratic practice. It breeds fear, it sustains anxiety, because the fact is that we are more likely to cross paths with one another, increasing social contact through work,
Yeah.
school, transportation, and education. And I don't believe it is completely, while it may not be conscious, it is not surprising to me that those are four areas of public policy that have been under continual attack since the victories of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But it's not just dealing with segregation in our society. We also have to do the work of answering the question, what does it mean to be an American? And what does American look like? And too often, that question is only answered by white nationalists and those opposed to democracy. When they say, who is an American? Nearly everyone listening on this call, on this seminar today, could define, right, what they mean. But when we say, this is America, we've not yet built that imagination where people see themselves as part of that future America. And here's the thing we have to understand: people don't go to a future that they cannot experience before they get there, right?
Yeah.
And if we are asking people to move towards an inclusive America that meets the needs of all, it doesn't sacrifice prosperity, it doesn't sacrifice safety, it doesn't sacrifice opportunity. it enhances it. People have to understand what that looks like. How can you understand that when generationally your experience has only been segregation, right? And white supremacy. So government, the arts, right, have to begin to engage in helping Oregonians and the American public spark that imagination to vision the future in the present day. Because the truth is the future isn't that far away. And we are creative communities. We have much more in common, right, than those who take advantage of our divisions want us to realize. There is no
So,
real urban or rural divide, right?
so
Many of
in a
us
way that,
face the same problems.
yeah, that's where I wanted to push in that direction a little bit. You actually wrote a piece for Oregon Humanities magazine talking about, you even said, I believe the phrase was, let's retire the tired old narrative about the rural urban divide. And can we just take that for a minute as a concrete example? There's two questions there. How do you retire a narrative? That's first
Yeah,
question. And I want to ask, not in an abstract way, but you, Eric K.
yeah,
Ward, how do you contribute to retiring a narrative? And second,
yeah,
that narrative in Oregon, where it's not only being foisted on us, it's also one that we repeat ourselves. So can I ask you those two
sure.
questions? How do you retire a narrative, and how do you move us forward to a narrative that feels like it has enough purchase to replace that one?
Yeah. So I think you have to you retire a narrative by refusing to adopt the language, right, and the notion of that narrative. The urban rural divide is a narrative that is designed, right, to subtly suggest that there are huge insurmountable divisions between
Hmm.
urban communities of color and immigrants, right, and white rural folks in Oregon, and that we are in competition with one another. Now, I don't know who benefits from that in Oregon, but I can tell you neither urban or rural communities are benefiting from
Uh-huh.
that myth. So the first thing we can do is to just stop using it because it's not a term any of us designed or used. By refusing to use it, we can reset the narrative, right? And the narrative needs to be direct conversations between urban and rural leaders. It's time for us to talk to one another about our experiences. And what I mean by that is, despite our ideological positions or political positions, this isn't, if we could approach this by understanding this isn't a left or right discussion. This isn't a conservative or liberal conversation. It's not a Republican or Democratic Party conversation. It is a discussion around, do we believe in inclusive communities? And two, right, do we understand that while we may be divided ideologically, that the values we hold are in much more alignment? And if we could identify what those values are that we hold in common, perhaps that is a way to then get into the room. So I'm being very specific right now.
Hmm.
Identify the values that are in common. Once you identify the values you have in common, get in a room, right? And instead of jumping to the solution, right, see if we can find agreement around the problems. Because perhaps if we stopped arguing over the solutions and spent more energy trying to understand, do we see the same problems? The
Yeah.
solutions might become more apparent to us based off of our values. So that's what I mean about replacing the urban rural myth. How do we replace it? We replace it by acknowledging, right, that many folks in rural communities face the same stereotypes, right,
Hmm.
that people of color face in urban communities, right? The same myths. We also face the same struggles. Now, there are differences, right? There are differences of privilege and access to networks. But at the end of the day, regardless of those differences, we do find the same problem And that means perhaps we can discover the same solutions together as well.
So
We can't
Eric,
let others divide us, though.
yeah, I mean, I feel like that last string of sentences you uttered described in many ways the work that the organization I spend my life with is trying to do. That is, we're trying to get people in rooms talking together. And so then, especially across differences of various kinds, to talk on the level you're describing, that is the level of values, rather than going right away to policy or solution. But I want to ask again, I'm going to try to ask as concrete a question as I
Yeah,
can, and that, like, in your work,
yeah,
who who do you find yourself talking with most? Are you
yeah.
in rooms that are uh, full of people coming from different places? When does that happen? How does it happen?
Mhm. Well, it's mostly been happening virtually uh, in this moment, uh, but I do. Um, I think it's important to try to maintain at least some lines of communications with different leaders who and different individuals who may hold drastically different opinions than I do or that Western State Center does. Uh, we have to and so that is critically important. The second, though, is that uh, in our leadership cohorts and trainings, right, we draw a pretty broader space in terms of who we think uh, we invite into the space, right? Our really defining piece here is that we are willing to have hard conversations, and it doesn't mean we won't have opinions, right?
Mhm,
So democracy is also vibrant, but we are willing to have conversations with any entity, right, that isn't seeking to dehumanize, right,
mhm,
other people to advance their goals. And we think that type of courageous conversations are critically important. So yes, I speak to folks as diverse as corrections officers, business leaders, folks who would, even though I'm on the left, would consider me probably a liberal, right?
yeah,
On folks in the radical left. I think police officers, where possible, it's important to stay in conversation, to keep people in the room. And many folks frame that as courageous conversations. But I think they're necessary conversations at the end of the day. I mean, look, we are a society, and a society has to figure out how it moves itself forward, how it meets the needs of one another. And that means everyone has to ultimately be part of the solution. Now, those solutions can't be won through violence, in my opinion.
mhm,
You cannot, uh, uh, if you use violence, it will always end in violence. And I think of Audre Lorde, African American lesbian feminist, who once wrote, right, you can't use the master's tools to destroy the master's house. And if the master's house is simply division, we do not bridge those divisions and the systemic bias that those divisions bring through violence, no matter how angry or justified that it feels.
mhm. So it's interesting because you started talking a little bit about divisions not only between, say, the white nationalist right and the activist left, but even on the left. And
Yes.
maybe we can go there a little bit because, again, I think some of what you've written recently has been about where is the left putting its focus. And you talk a little bit about uh, the difference between paying attention to ideological purity and paying attention to shared values. That feels like uh, in a way, a parallel to what you said a moment ago about ideological divides and shared challenges. Those feel to me like kind of analogs: ideological divides, ideological purity, shared challenges, shared values. How within the left, how's it been the last year or two for you uh, to sort of make the case that you're making about bridging? How's that been feeling?
Oh, I think it's hard in this moment, right? Uh, it's hard to find anyone on the right who is willing to
Mm-hmm.
lean in. It is We live in a partisan moment in American history, and a moment of significant change, and people have positioned themselves, right? And position themselves in a way that demands ideological purity, not value alignment, right?
Mm-hmm.
But ideological purity. And all of us, and I'll speak to folks on the left, right? All of us are smart enough, and I'll say it again: all of us are smart enough to understand that all ideologies are imperfect and have contradictions, right? Uh, it is a guide, not a rule book. And the second thing that I would say to those of us on the left that all of us understand um, is that we don't need ideology to teach us our values, right? Ideology helps give vehicle or perhaps a motion to our values. But our values shouldn't adjust and shift based off of our or the person we disagree with ideological position. And I think one of the problems in this moment is that I think I wrote about this in an essay, right? That in many ways, right, when you are the ones who are up by 30 points, right? What did I say? With just like minutes left in the clock, what do? Right? Do you try to double the point spread, right, and humiliate the other side, right? Or do you just run the clock out, right? You manage time and you manage the court, the basketball court, in the way that doesn't imperil your victory, but also doesn't annihilate your opponents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Humiliation, annihilation, dehumanization, right? That is the game of authoritarians. It is not the game, right, of those of us who believe in inclusive democracy. And partisanship and hard ideological purity, right, creates a burn it down mentality, right? It breeds an environment that is not much different than the Inquisition, right? It is a form of mass hysteria, right? And that I'm just going to use it like the burn it down concept we should understand is what began on the eastern shores of the United States in 1492, right? The burn it down is 250 years of chattel slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow and its cost of Black lives, right? It is that burn it down mentality that keeps women and the LGBTQ community from being able to have sovereignty over their bodies and lives. The burn it down mentality, in short, right, is the idea that we have the right to dominate others. And I want to be clear: in a democracy, you don't dominate. You find compromise. You move people forward. You have equity. And you continue to try to strengthen and build that society that the most vulnerable in our country deserve. That should be the basis. And so at the end of the day, how does it feel to be within the social justice left in the moment? I think for most folks, it feels really hard. The
Mm-hmm.
first is we have a movement that for some reason believes it's losing, right? And constantly acts as if it is losing, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The second is that it is so focused on purity that it will not engage anyone unless an individual checks all the ideological check boxes. And that means the left is becoming a subculture. A subculture is always out of touch with the mainstream of society and is rarely able to meet the needs of real people. The third is that when you become a subculture, you cut yourself off, right, from other people. And at the end of the day, people are essential to a healthy and equitable society.
Mm. So again, as you've presented this stuff, there's so many directions we could go. I kind of
Yeah,
want to go from, in a way, what you were just saying, both about domination, which I think it's interesting to think about some of the challenges in a democracy and some of the places we may be that both lead us there and threaten democracy. You talked about anxiety earlier. You're talking
yeah,
about domination now, and they're both. Uh, there's something seductive about both, the calls of both, and you're saying
yeah,
we need to resist both if we take the democratic project seriously. Uh,
yeah,
it's so clear if we took any one of these comments that you've made on its own and we put them all together, it's so clear that you've thought about this stuff and that you feel it deep on the inside. And I want to
yeah.
ask, uh, I want to make an observation that leads to a question. The observation is that our previous guest was Leah Satile, a journalist who has covered
Mm,
Tim McVeigh, the Bundy brothers. She's looked a lot at white nationalism, and she came to it. She had started by looking at punk music.
that's right.
You see where I'm going?
Oh yeah.
I
I
want to ask you
uh,
how it is that you came to think about things like compromise and
yeah,
staying free of domination. And it seems like music for you was, in a way, a step toward this. And I want to just ask about that arc a little bit.
yeah. So, it's I often talk about this, and I used to think it was generational, but now I've talked to enough younger leaders where I know it's not generational, it's situational, but I think it's worth expressing. So I came up in the punk and music scenes of Southern California in the late 70s and early 80s, right? And early enough where I was like sneaking out my house at 14. Don't do
Oh,
that, folks who are listening.
thank you. Thank you.
Um, right to uh, head to shows, and it was the emergence of the punk scene, and eventually in Los Angeles and in South Bay, Orange County, uh, that music scene quickly became um, violent, right? It became gang oriented in very real ways. And one of the ways that it became violent is that we began to see individuals showing up uh, who weren't wearing swastikas because they thought it was punk and edgy, right? They were wearing swastikas because they believed in what it stood for, right? And these were the first white power punks and then neo-Nazi skinheads to show up in the California punk rock scene. These were folks. Now you have to remember, it's probably hard to imagine, but sometimes I think, though it could be my memory, that the LA punk scene was more diverse then than it is today as a crossover movement, right? There's still a strong Latino punk scene in Southern California, but it was pretty diverse, right? There were Black, Latino, Asians, musicians in these bands. There were folks in the crowd. And these white power skinheads were attempting to police a scene that many of us felt we had constructed and built, right? And were telling us or telling our friends who could be or could not be in that space. And we had to make a decision at that age, right? Were we going to abandon, right, the scene that we had put so much energy in and had become our primary identity, right, amongst us? Or were we going to stand up and try to defend it? And we chose to stand up and try to defend that in the ways that we best understood to do that at that point, right? Which was we were being physically attacked. No one was responding to that, right? Not we would get beaten up in the clubs and then get beat up by the police outside the clubs.
Mm,
Folks don't remember this, but I'm old enough now, right? When I walked 30 miles to the snow to go see Black Flag, right? Not really, it wasn't snowing. And I I remember, right, white power skins attacking us in the show, right, and then coming out and being beaten by police officers, right, because punk rockers for a period in LA were getting beaten almost as much as young folks of color in the city, right, and we decided to fight back. No one was coming to protect us. I think that taught me something, and what it taught me was that sometimes the things that we work hard to construct come under assault for lots of different reasons. Sometimes because people actually want to be a part of it, but they don't know how without dominating, right? Sometimes because people don't like the threat that community and the values that it espouses holds, and that's what we witnessed there. But for me, I think the idea of understanding how hard, I'm a DIY kid, and so I know how hard it is to build things, and democracy was built off the sacrifice of generations of Black lives, right? Not just over the last 10 years, right? But over hundreds of years. Native people, poor whites, immigrants. But Black people really struggled for democracy and died for democracy. And it has got us to this point. And I am just not so callous or nihilistic to turn my back on generations of struggle. If Black folks felt democracy was so important to fight and die over, I'm not so quick to get rid of it. But I'll say one other piece. It is the power of culture, right? I grew up at this time, as I was saying, where desegregation was happening. And I was dealing with a social movement, a growing social movement that was telling me I could not be with my friends, right?
Mhm.
And and if you faced busing and you got put into another school, I got moved to an all-white school. When you're in high school, the one thing you're looking for is what identity, right? And it wasn't going to be white identity, and there wasn't enough of us Black folks for there to be a strong Black identity. So we had to find something else, and it was punk rock. Eventually, I was in a band, right? I think I say this in every talk, and folks are going to roll their eyes, but I was in a band. I was like the lead singer. And then after I left it, it went on to become popular, right? They changed their name to Sublime, and history is written. But I remember the early days of that band. And I remember how we all had different backgrounds and
Yeah.
different points of privilege and network, and we all wanted to play different types of music. I wanted to play pure ska, right? Bradley wanted to play dance hall, right? Eric wanted to play punk, and we had to figure out, right, how to bring that together, right? How did we compromise? How did we and I think that taught me the power, right, of compromise. Compromise isn't a loss. Compromise brings the best opportunities to the table. It allows us to create something new.
So again, lots of questions firing in my head because of what you're saying. One is you're just talking about identity, and I want to ask, you ever run into people who don't know you because of your introduction preceding you, and do they say, "Hey, what do you do?"
Yeah.
How do you
People ask
answer
me
that?
what I do all the time.
How do you answer
Yeah.
that?
Well, what I do uh, is I tell people their stories, right? And I help people understand uh, that their stories, right, aren't stories of fear and scarcity. That's someone else's story that we live under, right? Our stories are about hope, right? Our stories are about the ability to feed our kids and still pay our utility bills, right? And still meet our mortgage without having to work 4 jobs, right? Our stories are about wanting to spend time with our friends in the backyard, barbecuing, or out fly fishing, right? Or out at the hip hop show, right? Or out at the folk festival in Bend. Those are our stories. Our stories are about honoring those who have passed away, right? And celebrating the new lives that come upon us each and every year. That's what I do. I try to remind people, Western State Center tries to remind people that this dystopian novel that we are being fed in this country right now is nothing more than a story, but it's not even our story, right? It's the story of folks who are afraid of the future. But the future isn't frightening, right? The future is actually really vibrant and it's really exciting. We then take those stories, right? People's stories, and we try to then give people the tools to make those stories a reality. In short, I think Angela Davis said this once, right? You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Western State Center helps people not to act that by providing them the tools to network together, to understand what policy change looks like, but also to put forth their imagination. You don't have to be afraid of your imagination. Your imagination can move mountains. And you have to believe in yourself and know that that's exactly what we can do as a community, as individuals, and as a country.
Uh, I've never answered the question of what I do nearly as well as you just answered it. Like
Oh,
I wish
thank
I
you.
had an answer like that for any various dinners where people asked me and I gave a middling response. I do think it's interesting to consider the challenge of, on one hand, looking so squarely at the really dangerous, uh, unquestionable challenges to democracy all around us and that we're coming out of. And you know better than most of us the truth of these, whether we're talking about white nationalism, racism, anti Semitism, uh, so many things we could point to. And at the same time, to hold what feels to me like such an optimistic vision of the possibilities that not only are in front of us, but that we're already realizing. I think I want to move us to conclude by giving you back some words that you wrote in a recent piece. You wrote a piece called 21 Things We Can Do Right Now. And I just want to name the verbs because I think that the title of the piece emphasizing doing and thinking about again the relationship between belief or imagination and action. The verbs that you then that show up in that list, I just want to read them to you and ask you for sort of final thoughts before we turn to uh, people talking to each other through the Zoom link to think about some of what you've been talking about. The verbs you give, and I'm not even naming what the verbs point towards, but in this idea of what we can do right now: recognize, honor, understand, condemn, demand, be troubled by, raise concern, decry, acknowledge, demand, again, build, insist, lift up, raise alarm, condemn, demand, call on, press, acknowledge, bring together, support, respect, educate. I'm going to just ask, when you hear your verbs back there in that list, what does that have you thinking about?
Yeah. I mean, it's been months since I wrote that essay, and in that essay, I was warning, right, that the attempt to create an American democracy is now on a precipice. Now, it doesn't mean we can't bridge that precipice, right? What it means is we have to understand that the words and actions that we use carry real consequence. What I mean by pressing and demand is I just want to reinforce that when I'm talking about bridging, when I'm talking about finding one another, I'm not telling folks they have to leave their passion, right? I want them to bring that passion. We want to bring disagreement, right? but we want to understand that at the end of the day, right, that we have to continue to move forward. And I talked a little bit about the anxiety, right? And I would almost put it like in a, I don't know if it's a metaphor, but we should think about it this way. Uh, there are people who have a fear of flying in a society. And what we understand is the way you overcome a fear of flying, right, is to actually fly more, right? And the way we overcome disagreement is actually by having the disagreements. But you can't have a disagreement if the disagreement can only end up this way. If I'm telling you, if I don't get my way, right? If I don't get my way, uh, then I'm going to pick up a weapon and
Mm,
throw revolution, right? That isn't a debate. That isn't inclusive democracy. We also don't get to democracy if we don't understand that no one's humanity, right, can be sacrificed in these conversations, that we have to fundamentally respect the idea that humans have fundamental rights that must be respected and that equity is a fundamental right. With that said, we have to keep the tension, right? This isn't about releasing, and this is where it sounds almost contradictory, but we can't release the tension. We actually have to hold the tension, and we have to learn how to manage that tension. And that means we increasingly have to be in space with one another. And that means we need democratic practice that allows us to do that. Because authoritarianism or anti democracy, it may claim to be a mass movement, right? It may claim to represent people, but it is anti people. It spends most of its time, right? Authoritarian movements dividing, right? Who gets to belong in the in group. And we have to build a counter to that by being brave enough to increase space. And I'll just say this, what those words really mean, right? And I'll say this because I know it irks folks, is there has to be a center in American politics, right?
mm,
There has to be a center in democracy. And I don't mean a mushy middle. What I
mhm,
mean is the center is where we come to do the business of our communities in our country. And if there is no center, those who are winning, right, are responsible for constructing that center so that that work can get done. We cannot stay in our purest silos. If we stay in our purity silos, if we are saying this is just about domination, right? Domination is an existential crisis. If you tell me you're going to dominate me, right, I'm going to respond as if it is an existential threat, right, to me. There is no existential threat. And we have to stop acting like we are giving one or that we are receiving one. In short, the precipice of democracy is the belief that democracy is not strong enough to overcome the very real challenges that we face today. That is what will send us tumbling over the edge. And that is what people are spending so much energy trying to convince us of, that democracy doesn't work. But guess what? Democracy does work, right? Despite itself, it continues to grow and strengthen. If we can't believe in anything else, right, we need to believe in that. Because if you want to defend democracy, you got to first believe in democracy.
mm. Okay, so you've given us lots. And, it's interesting. We talked about anxiety early, and we're finishing with tension. And I think anxiety leading towards authoritarianism, and tension, especially dynamic tension, leaving us with that thought to think about that's democracy. Dynamic
That's
tension.
democracy.
Like that center you're talking about feels like what keeps it is those dynamic tensions meeting there. Eric, I want to say a huge thanks to you. It's great to talk to you again several years down the road, and I look forward to continuing
Yes.
to be in conversation with you and continuing to Follow the work that you and Western State Center are doing. I also think this is a beautiful bridge towards what Clint Smith is going to help us think about just 6 days from now. He's looking a lot at memory and commemoration as we try to build a stronger democracy, again emphasizing race, and as we think about how this all comes together, dynamic tension. Um, for those on the call that would like to join, I hope you will follow the Zoom link and talk to each other and start building the center Eric's talking about. Not start building, keep jumping into it.
That's right.
I want to thank you all for joining us. Eric, I want to thank you again and wish you the best as we move into spring and continue with the revolution of the imagination. Thank you for helping us think into that.
Appreciate you. Night, everyone.